The mountains have always held a certain mystique. Silent guardians draped in emerald cloaks of pine and shrouded in mist. They were a constant presence in my childhood, a comforting backdrop to our little town nestled in the valley. We lived amongst them, respected their power, but never truly feared them. Until the summer the whistling started. It began subtly, a whisper on the wind, easily dismissed as a bird or a trick of the breeze, but it persisted. Each day, as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long, ominous shadows, the whistling would return. It seemed to emanate from the old mountain road that snaked its way up into the heart of the range, a road seldom used and shrouded in local legend. The bus ride home from school was always a bumpy affair. The old vehicle rattled and groaned its way along the narrow road, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Usually the ride was filled with the chatter of students eager to escape the confines of school. But not that summer. An unsettling silence had fallen over us, broken only by the rustle of backpacks and the ever-present hum of the engine. All of us, it seemed, were listening for it. The whistling. The road was a ribbon of asphalt unfurling through a tunnel of trees, their branches heavy with leaves intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out the last rays of the setting sun. Each bend in the road brought a fresh wave of apprehension. The woods pressed in close, dark and silent, save for the rustling of unseen creatures. The whistling was closer now, a haunting melody carried on the breeze. It seemed to weave its way between the trees, a mournful, lonely sound that sent shivers down my spine. I huddled deeper into my seat, clutching my backpack to my chest. My heart pounded against my ribs, keeping time with the rhythmic thump of the bus's engine. The other kids on the bus were eerily quiet. Some stared out the windows, their faces pale and drawn. Others sat with their eyes squeezed shut as if trying to block out the sound. The air inside the bus was thick with tension, a palpable fear that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. The bus driver, a grizzled old man named Hank, kept his eyes fixed on the road. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight. He had been driving this route for years, but even he seemed unnerved by the strange events of the past few weeks. As we rounded a particularly sharp bend, the bus lurched violently, throwing me against the window. Gasps and nervous murmurs rippled through the bus. I looked out the window, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the edge of the woods, stood a figure. It was difficult to make out in the fading light, but it appeared to be a tall, slender figure, draped in what looked like a long, flowing cloak. It stood motionless, its back to the road, as if listening to something deep within the forest. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I turned to see if anyone else had witnessed what I had, but the other kids were too preoccupied with their own fear to notice. Only Hank, his eyes narrowed in the rearview mirror, seemed to have caught a glimpse of the figure. He said nothing, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened, and his foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The bus rumbled on, the silence even more profound than before. The whistling had stopped, replaced by an unnerving stillness. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching us, waiting. The next day, the bus ride was no less terrifying. The memory of the figure in the woods played in my mind, fueling my anxiety. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, my heart leaping into my throat at every flicker of shadow. The whistling, when it came, seemed louder, closer, more insistent. As the bus navigated a particularly dense stretch of forest, I noticed something move in the undergrowth. It was a fleeting glimpse, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I wasn't the only one who had seen it. A hushed whisper ran through the bus, a wave of unease washing over the students. Even Hank, his usual stoicism shaken, cast nervous glances into the woods. We all felt it. Something was out there, watching us from the shadows, something that brought with it an icy dread that seemed to seep into our very bones. That evening, unable to shake the feeling of unease, I confided in my grandfather. He was a man who had spent his life in these mountains, a man who knew their secrets and their stories. He listened patiently, his weathered face etched with concern as I recounted the strange events of the past few days. "The whistling," he murmured, his voice low and grave. "That's her song, they say." "Her song?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze distant, lost in thought. "There's an old tale," he began, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "A story they tell of a young woman who died on that mountain road years ago. Her lover, they say, abandoned her there, left her to die alone." He paused, his eyes meeting mine. "They say her spirit still wanders these woods, searching for the man who betrayed her. And her song is a warning." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver down my spine. I had always dismissed the local legends as mere folklore, but now, with the memory of the whistling and the shadowy figure fresh in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to these stories. The next evening, the bus ride was almost unbearable. The air inside felt heavy, thick with dread. Every creak of the bus, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent my heart racing. The whistling started earlier than usual, a mournful wail that seemed to echo through the very mountains themselves. It was closer now, stronger, filled with a raw, visceral emotion that sent shivers down my spine. And then I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, a ghostly figure bathed in the pale light of the moon. Her long white dress flowed around her like mist, and her hair, long and black as night, streamed out behind her. Her face, though, was hidden from view, obscured by a veil of darkness. The bus screeched to a halt, its brakes protesting loudly. Inside, chaos erupted as students screamed and scrambled for safety. Hank, his face ashen, gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with strain. The figure began to move, gliding towards the bus with an unnatural grace. Terror, raw and primal, surged through me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away from the spectral figure that was drawing ever closer. The whistling intensified, morphing into a heart-wrenching wail that seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. It was a sound of pure anguish, of betrayal, of a sorrow so profound that it echoed through the ages. The figure reached the bus, her ethereal hand pressing against the glass. I could see her face now, pale and drawn, her eyes burning with a cold, otherworldly fire. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I felt a surge of icy cold shoot through my body. Time seemed to stop. The other students, the bus, even Hank, all faded away, leaving only me and the ghostly figure staring at each other through the glass. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the moment was gone. The figure vanished, the whistling ceased, and the bus was plunged into an eerie silence. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. The other students were staring at me, their faces pale and drawn. Hank, his face ashen, slowly released his grip on the steering wheel. We were all in shock, our minds struggling to comprehend what we had just witnessed. But one thing was clear, we were trapped, the bus wouldn't start. Hank turned the key again and again, but the engine only sputtered and died. We were stranded, alone on that desolate mountain road, with only the echo of the ghostly wail and the memory of the figure's burning eyes for company. Fear, thick and suffocating, filled the bus. Some of the students began to cry, their sobs echoing through the stillness. Others sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with terror. Hank, to his credit, was the first to regain his composure. He pulled out his cell phone, but there was no signal. We were on our own. He turned to us, his voice surprisingly calm. "We need to get out of here," he said, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the students. "We need to get to higher ground. There's a ranger station a few miles up the road. If we can get there, we can call for help." His words galvanized us into action. We scrambled out of the bus, our eyes darting nervously into the surrounding woods. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and a light mist hung in the air, obscuring the moon and stars. We set off up the road, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the frantic beating of our hearts. We walked for what felt like hours, the fear clinging to us like a shroud. Just when our hope began to dwindle, we saw it, the faint glow of lights in the distance. The ranger station. We had escaped.